In this interactive video, we're going to cover some of the essentials of Judaism. So just a tiny bit of brief history. Judaism arose over 3,500 years ago in Canaan, which is Israel slash Palestine today, that territory. And the origins of Jewish faith are explained throughout the Torah. And according to this text, God first revealed himself to a Hebrew man named Abraham, who became known as the founder of Judaism. And Jews believe that God made this special covenant with Abraham and that he and his descendants were a chosen people who would create a great nation. So Abraham's son Isaac and his grandson Jacob also became central figures in ancient Jewish history, and Jacob took the name Israel, and his children and future generations became known as Israelites. And more than 1,000 years after Abraham, the prophet Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt after being enslaved for hundreds of years. And according to scriptures, God revealed his laws, known as the Ten Commandments, to Moses at Mount Sinai. So we'll take a look at the principal texts of Judaism. First, there's the Tanakh, and that's the Hebrew Bible. And this word Tanakh is an acronym of the first Hebrew letter of each of the Masoretic texts, three traditional subdivisions. So the Torah, which means teaching, the Nevi'im, which is prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is writings. So TNK, Tanakh. And non-Jews and Jews alike also use the term the Old Testament. Then there's the Torah, which is also referred to as the Pentateuch. And those are the first 5 of the 24 books of the Tanakh. And it's usually printed with rabbinic commentaries. So we're talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then there's the Talmud, and that's Hebrew for study. And the Talmud is the central text of rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of Jewish religious law and theology. And it's used mainly by scholars. So you can see the breakdown here, right? You'll have Talmud and commentary that's given by rabbis, and the Mishnah. It's an interesting text. So of the Jews, Houston Smith, who's the author of our textbook, says, if the key to the achievement of the Jews lies neither in their antiquity nor in the proportions of their land and history, where does it lie? The lead that we shall follow is this: what lifted the Jews from obscurity to permanent religious greatness was their passion for meaning. So, first we'll look at meaning in God for the Jews. So, briefly, there's a question as to what Judaism is often discussed as the first monotheistic religion, or the first religion with one God, monotheism. It's a little disputed, though, so it's arguably the first monotheistic religion. But some claim it was Zoroastrianism, which was pre-Islamic Iran in that second millennium BCE. And some claim it was Atenism, that's first millennium BCE, that's Egypt. But it's, that's just a slightly disputed fact, if you will. So the Jewish quest for meaning was rooted in their understanding of God. So It's a God that for the Jews was single, right? Monotheistic and unified. God that was supreme, nature transcending, above and beyond nature. In other words, personal, righteous, loving, and also what we'll just refer to as the triple omni, which is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibeneficent. So that means all powerful, all knowing, and all good. The Jews also looked for meaning in creation. Now, remember, we kicked this off with what Houston Smith had to say was what makes the Judaism a great and enduring religion is how they looked for meaning in everything, which apparently was unlike many other religions or belief systems prior to Judaism. This is the contention here. So the Jews looked for meaning in creation. So from the get-go, Judaism affirms the world's goodness, arriving at that conclusion through its assumption that God created it, right? So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and pronounced it to be good. So that's the starting point. God made all this stuff and said it was good. So that's where we begin. So when you begin with this premise, it follows that however things may seem at any given time, the world is unimpeachably good in itself, without question. And then from that, it follows that people should look for the causes of their problems, not in the world, because it's good from the get-go, but within themselves and in their immediate spheres of influence. Don't blame the world for your problems. Look within. And look within others and in your social systems and in your hierarchies. That's where your problems lie, not in the world itself. So this approach, in turn, inspires creativity. You got to get creative if that's where you're looking for your problems, because by their nature, your problems are going to, if they're not rooted in the world as such, but they're rooted in yourself and in the people around you and the way you've organized yourselves, then that it follows from that that you have some control over it. And if you have some control over it, it requires creativity in order to fix yourself, right yourself with the world, reorganize, reassess, reevaluate not only yourself, but the people around you and the way that you've set things up. So the very goodness of nature. So from the premise of the goodness of creation itself also stems the goodness of the created world itself. And the Jews refused to regard nature and the material world as like illusory or defective or unimportant, like, other religions did, like the world is an illusion or there's something wrong with it inherently or it's just not important because it's the spirit world that's important, right? The Jews didn't regard nature this way. They thought nature was to be relished in all of its manifestations, like, food, aesthetic beauty, sex, if it's in marriage, and also material possessions. So just as an aside, the prophets weren't against material wealth itself. They were against maldistribution. So just compare this to some other attitudes toward nature. So, for instance, the Tao Te Ching, China, says this on the place of humans within nature. Those who would take over the earth and shape it to their will never succeed. But the book of Genesis says this about the place of humans in nature. God created the earth and then let human beings have dominion over the earth. And behold, it was very good. So here in the Tao, it's like, don't try to exercise your will over the earth. You'll never succeed. But in Judaism and in the book of Genesis, they're saying, hey, God created it and gave it to us to lord over. It is ours. Look at how vastly different these two attitudes toward nature are. And another quick aside, which of these two do you think lent itself to the emergence of modern science? Thinking that you can't shape the earth to your will, or that you can? Well, the answer is that you can. Right? That's the attitude that lent itself to the emergence of modern science, be it good, bad, or indifferent. It's the case. And so, for instance, Sir Francis Bacon, who lived in the 16th and 17th centuries, was considered by some to be the father of modern science, and is very famous for his saying, "Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed." Right? It's a little bit of a split between the two of these, but he also said that nature needs to be dominated, right? That nature essentially needs to be, I think at some point he said something similar to, has to have her secrets tortured out of her, right? So the Jews found, following this thread, of course, meaning in human existence. They sought truth for life, right? What is the case about our existence in order that our existence can be augmented, improved, right? And they wanted to understand the human condition in its highest reaches. How far can we go? What are we capable of? What can we do? What can we endure? What can we create, right? And the striking feature of the Jewish view of human nature is that they acknowledge both human frailty and the human capacity for this unspeakable grandeur, right? We're frail and grand. We're a blend of dust and divinity. And human beings, once created, they make or break themselves. They forge their own destinies through their own decisions, meaning a robust sense of free will within Judaism. And also, people are God's beloved children. God is your father under Judaism, and you are his favorite. We are his favorite under Judaism, and he loves us. This gives human existence a special place within the scheme of things. So, grandeur, sin, freedom, and divine parentage are essentially the ingredients for a creatively meaningful image of human existence, right? Like, we are these grand, fabulous things, but we're also sinful, and we have this radical freedom, and we're of divine parentage. I mean, that, starting from those premises, just about basic human existence, you're bound to, they entail that you see your life as meaningful. So the Jews also sought meaning in history. So Bernard Anderson, who's an Old Testament scholar, or was, said, ultimate reality is disclosed when man, either by rational contemplation or mystic assent, goes beyond the flow of events which we call history. The goal is the apprehension of an order of reality unaffected by the unpredictable fortunes of mankind. So for Hindus, one must pierce through the veil of Maya, cultivate and escape from the cycle of samsara, and allow his or her individuality to fade into Brahman, right? For on the other hand, for ancient Greek philosophers, the task was to recognize the repeating cycles of change in nature and then fix the mind upon the unchanging absolute that underlies it all, right? Recognize that the change that we all see around us comes in cycles, but discern and distill what is permanent and unchanging underneath all of that change. But for the Jews, history is neither Maya nor a circular process of nature. It's the arena of God's purposive activity. It is the field of activity for God and what God wants from us and what God's purposes and aims are for us. That's what history is for the Jews. Right? That God kind of reveals throughout history what he really wants from us and expects from us. So what's at stake when we ask if there is meaning in history? Why is this even an important question, right? History happens, history unfolds, things occur one after another in a temporal nature, right? X happens, then Y, then Z, and we write them down and we look at them and we study them. To some people, this is not especially meaningful, right? But if you're wondering why it's meaningful and what's at stake, where this question is concerned, well, Houston Smith says, at stake is our whole attitude toward the social order and collective life within it. If we decide that history is meaningless, it follows that the social, political, and cultural contexts of life do not warrant active concern. And to the extent that we see things this way, we shall take little interest in and feel little responsibility for the problems that beset societies, cultures, and civilizations. And over here, this is Albert Camus, who was a philosopher. And so essentially, if you say, look, history is meaningless, it doesn't mean anything, there's no meaning to tease out of it, there's no a sort of possible plan or progress that you can see throughout the unfolding of history. It's an attitude you can take, all right? And it may actually be the case. But if it is the attitude you take, it amounts to what's called nihilism. And nihilism, think of the word to annihilate, right? If you annihilate something, you're rendering it into nothingness. So nihilism is like nothingness philosophy. That's a really general way of saying it. It means different, nihilism means different things in different contexts, but it's essentially a negating of meaning very often. Camus said, nihilism is not only despair and negation, but above all, the desire to despair and to negate. So, on the importance of the question of whether or not there actually is meaning in history. It's an existential one, in other words. So then, why else should we believe that history is meaningful? Why else? Well, some reasons are laid out. So first, the historical context in which life is lived affects that life in every way, right? Wherever and whenever you are born, that's a concrete set of circumstances that are going to determine most of everything about your life, your problems, your opportunities, your outcomes, everything. Think about that in terms of our own history. Think about if you were an African American born under slavery. in the United States. You are born within a set of problems with a minimal, if any, number of opportunities, and the way your life is going to turn out is restricted and defined and delineated by the where and when. In other words, the historical context in which you were born, right? So, I think that's incontrovertible truth for human beings, that history is meaningful. But there are more reasons, right? If contexts are crucial for life, as was stipulated in the first, in number one, then so is collective action, like planning, organizing, and acting together so as to condition the historical context. If the historical context can, in a sense, close you off from all opportunities and define your existence in it can do it in a positive way or a negative way. It can do it in a wealthy way or a poor way. But if you happen to be on the poor end, for instance, with no opportunities, and if these contexts are crucial for life, then collective action is important so that you can help condition and change, in other words, the historical context. So it's more favorable not only to you if you happen to be born with the short end of the stick, but for others like you. And history is a field of opportunity for learning and changing. And according to Judaism, God shapes each sequence as a teaching experience for his people. And then all events are important, but they're not equally important. So each opportunity is unique, but some of them are decisive. So for India, human destiny lies outside of history altogether. Judaism, by contrast, laid the groundwork for social protest in the here and now, and the possibility of, again, conditioning one's historical context, grabbing the wheel of history, if you will, and steering it in a direction that may be more favorable to you, your people, and people like you is the idea. And hopefully, eventually, for all people. It's in the hands, or excuse me, in the lands influenced by the Jewish historical perspective that the chief thrusts for social betterment have occurred. So the argument in the book is being made that that under Judaism and Jewish practices and thinking, we see the onset of larger scale social activism, really, movements of social justice. Also, the Jews sought meaning in morality. And so these are we'll discuss briefly the 4 ethical precepts of the 10 Commandments. Like the 10 Commandments, many of us are already, or if not most of us, are already familiar with, at least in a general fashion. But there's 4 ethical precepts of the 10 Commandments. So to begin with and to lay it down, without any moral constraints, without any moral prohibitions, if you will, human relations could and would and do become chaotic and even barbaric. So Jewish ethical prescriptions are considered those wise restraints that make men free. So although they are restraining you, restraint is the opposite of free. They are restraints upon your behavior that actually make you free and make others and allow others to be free. So the Hebrew Bible contains no less than 613 commandments that regulate human behavior, but we'll look at the 4 that can cause unlimited trouble according to Judaism if they're left unheeded. And those are commandments about force, wealth, sex, and speech. So first, about force, thou shalt not murder. So you can bicker and fight, that's fine and understandable, but killing within the in-group will not be permitted because it instigates blood feuds that shred community. It causes damage to the community. That's why you can't murder, right? Thou shalt not murder or kill. Wealth, thou shalt not steal. So as for possessions, you can make your pile or your heap or the stuff you have as large as you want, get as much stuff as you please, be shrewd and cunning in your business enterprises. But one thing you can't do, and that's steal from somebody else's stuffs, the stuff that somebody else has accumulated. Why? Because this outrages the sense of fair play and builds animosities in the community that become ungovernable. Right? When you steal from somebody else, it makes other people pissed off in the community. It undermines the sense of fair play, makes people angry at each other, and this causes rifts in the community. So, thou shalt not steal. Sex, thou shalt not commit adultery. So, Judaism says you can be flirtatious and you can even be promiscuous. And although we don't condone that behavior, we're not going to get the law after you about it. But at one point, we, the Jews, draw the line. Sexual indulgence of married persons outside of the nuptial bond will not be allowed. Well, why? Because it arouses the passions the community cannot tolerate. It makes people jealous, resentful. Its passional nature is too much for the community to contain. In other words, again, causes problems for the community. So thou shalt not commit adultery. And then speech. Thou shalt not bear false witness. So the Jews say you may posture and be ambiguous, be pretentious, right? But there's one time when we require that you tell the truth and nothing but the truth. And if a dispute reaches such proportions as to be brought before a tribunal, like a court, on such occasions the judges must know what happened. So if you lie then, while under oath to tell the truth, the penalty will be severe. Now, why? Because, once again, what's common to the 3 slides before this and this one, it causes damage to the community. When there's a problem in the community and it has to be brought to court and in front of the judges, you need to tell it like it is so the judges can right the problem, correct the problem, and balance the scales of justice, if you will. If you lie, then you are offsetting the scales of justice, damaging the community, and the penalty is going to be severe. So don't bear false witness. Once again, the 4 of these moral precepts that we are drawing from the 10 Commandments, their specific focus is on not just don't do all this stuff, but don't do all this stuff because it damages our community. We want to keep our community whole and as a living, moving body that can affect history over time. We want to keep it powerful. So meaning in justice. The Jews sought meaning in justice. It's to the Hebrew prophets more than to any others that Western civilization owes these 2 convictions. And number 1, that's the future of any people, in large part depends upon the justice of its social order. And that, 2, individuals are responsible for these social structures, as well as for their direct personal leanings. These are your responsibilities, Judaism says. The way things are set up and your place within it. So justice is linked to prophecy in Judaism. So in the evolution of the concept of social justice, prophecy was indispensable to the Jews. And this prophetic movement passed through three stages. That's the Prophetic Guilds, pre-writing, and writing. And we'll take each in turn. So in the first of these stages was in the form of Prophetic Guilds. So a guild is like a group, like an early union, if you will, where prophecy was a group phenomenon and the group experienced a collective, like self-induced ecstasy, right? It was a group thing where where people got together and got lost in the mind meld, if you will, and received sort of visions, right? And prophesized. And at this stage, there was no like ethical dimension to the prophecies. It was just an onrush of ecstatic experience that demonstrated God's power to them. Right? When this sort of group collective ecstatic experience took them over, they saw this as evidence of God working through them and within them. The second stage was the pre-writing prophets, the individuals. So the pre-writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha, they still had a guild base or a group base. So they still did that prophetic guild group ecstasy thing, but they could also receive the divine visitation, if you will, while they were alone. They didn't need the group experience in order to experience that. So under Judaism, or Judaism says that the divine, or God, spoke more clearly through them because of this, because they could receive that divine visitation while they were alone. And it began to manifest itself not just in ecstatic emotion, right, like it did in the previous stage, but in like ethical demands for social justice. For example, Elijah's defiance of King Ahab, who had framed and stoned Naboth. So God came into the heart of Elijah, who had no official position, and said to the king, "In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will also lick up your blood." Right? So that's an ethical dimension to this prophetic ecstasy that the Jews speak of Elijah as having had. And also the story of King David and Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan. These are all stories, if you wanted to look into them, about the second stage and the pre-writing, the second stage of prophecy and the pre-writing individual prophets. And then the third stage was the writing prophets. And at this stage, both of those previous stages, the prophetic guilds and the pre-writing prophets, both of those stages elements were still present for the writing prophets, but the prophets were able to discern injustices beyond individual acts and into the social fabric where they tend to be hidden. So in other words, where the pre-writing prophets were able to, they would receive like, hey, X did bad things to Y, and Y did bad things to Z, and you need to let them know that, right? That was more of an individual acts of injustice that the pre-writing prophets could see. The writing prophets, once they started to write, the ideas they were able to see more into, more deeply, if you will. So now they're not just seeing like, hey, this person harmed that person or that person harmed this person. They're able to look into the social fabric and say, look, the way that things are built, the way that things are set up, and the way that things are operating, the status quo, there's something wrong with it, and it's churning out people who do bad things. So we got to fix the social fabric. Well, this, according to Judaism, didn't occur until these prophets actually started writing. I mean, ostensibly started thinking harder about the matter. And that's when these sorts of social injustices started to come to the fore for the Hebrew prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, who challenged corruptions in the social order and oppressive institutions. That was the aim of their prophecy. And thanks to the prophets, what other nations would have interpreted as just a power squeeze, the Jews saw as God's warning to clean up their national life and establish justice throughout the land or be destroyed. Follow God's will, establish justice throughout the land or be destroyed. And then there is the prophetic principle. And stated abstractly, the prophetic principle goes like this. The prerequisite of political stability is social justice, for it is in the nature of things that injustice will not endure. So, stated theologically, the point reads, look, God has high standards. God will not put up forever with exploitation, corruption, and mediocrity. And one thing is common to all the Jewish prophets, and that's the conviction that every human being, simply by virtue of his or her humanity, is a child of God and therefore in possession of rights that even kings must respect. So wealth and splendor count for nothing compared with purity, justice, and mercy for the Jews. And then last, there's meaning in suffering. So this is the Assyrian Empire here, respectively. So from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, Israel and Judah, they tottered, right? They were unsteady in front of the aggressive power of Syria, Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. And Israel and Judah eventually fell to them during this time. So the prophets found meaning in this predicament. There's suffering. They fell, which means there's suffering, right? So the prophets found meaning in their predicament by seeing this suffering, right? When they were conquested, by seeing this suffering as God's way of underscoring or highlighting the demand for righteousness. So during the Assyrian conquest and exile, during this exile, the Jews became the 10 long, they were not distributed, but because they were taken over, they were dispersed throughout the land. They were no longer unified. They became the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And then in 586 BCE, Judah, which was the southern kingdom, that was conquered too. So Judah was conquered as well as the territory known as Israel. And God was using Israel's enemies against her. And this is the way it was interpreted, right? So the experience of defeat and exile by the Assyrians over the Jews was teaching the Jews the true worth of freedom. This is the way they interpreted it, right? Not just, oh, we're being conquered, but we're being tested. We're being tested and we're being educated on the true value of freedom because apparently we needed it. Right? This was the interpretation of the way the Jews interpreted the Assyrian conquest and exile. So another lesson was that those who remain faithful in the face of all of this adversity and conquest and suffering will eventually be vindicated. So again, meaning. So stated abstractly, the deepest meaning the Jews found in their exile was the meaning of vicarious suffering. Right? Vicarious meaning suffering that you experience through the eyes of when you look at others suffering, right? Not necessarily your own personal suffering, but vicarious suffering, meaning that enters lives that are willing to endure pain that others might be spared it. Quote is, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And then meaning in Messianism. So though the Jews were able to find their suffering meaningful, meaning for them did not end there. It climaxed in Messianism. So this idea of progress, that the historical progress that the Jews adhered to and believed in, that's the belief that the conditions of life can improve and that history can, in this sense, get somewhere. It originated in the West. So insofar as other peoples have come to this notion, they've acquired it from the West. And as striking as this fact is, it seems explicable. So if we confine ourselves to the two other enduring civilizations at the time, the South Asian, centering in India, and East Asian, centering in China and its cultural offshoots, we find that their presiding outlooks were forged by people who were in power, right? So in India, these were the Brahmins, and in China, these were the literati. So by contrast, the West's outlook was decisively shaped in this matter by the Jews, who for the most of their formative period were underdogs. Ruling classes may be satisfied with the status quo, like up here, but underdogs are not. So the idea of a Messiah to come and save and right the way of the world makes sense if the perspective is being formed by underdogs, right? You don't need a Messiah if the perspective and presiding outlook is being forged by those in power. Why do you need a savior if people who are writing the script are in power? If the people who are writing the script are the underdogs, it makes sense that you've got a savior coming, or a Messiah, so to speak. And hope, the experience of hope takes up more of a hold on the human heart when there's concrete evidence of it, when it becomes concrete. So eventually, Jewish hope came to be personified in the figure of a coming Messiah. And during the Babylonian exile, which was 5th century BCE, the Jews began to hope for a redeemer who would effect the ingathering of the exiles to their native homeland. And after the destruction of the temple, the second destruction, that is, which was in 70 current era, the honorific title Messiah was used to designate the person who would rescue the Jews from that diaspora, right? The lost tribes of Israel who were dispersed throughout the territory. They were waiting for someone to come and rescue them. Okay, that was a long one, but topics covered. It was the first really of the monotheistic religions we looked at, so we needed to lay the groundwork, right? So topics covered: some brief history of Judaism, the principal texts of Judaism, and then what the Jews did that was, at least from the perspective of our textbook, singular and first in history, was that it was to charge everything with meaning and significance. And for the Jews, that was meaning in God, creation, human existence, history, morality, justice, suffering, and Messianism.